Hey everyone, welcome back to Onward podcast. This is Brett, and I am back with another episode today. Shifting gears a little bit, but not entirely. And I feel like today's podcast is going to sort of dovetail on an article I recently wrote, which is all about birth certificates and human capital and that sort of stuff, and also following on the sovereignty path. But to be honest with you, I'm not quite sure where our conversation is going to go today. My guest today is Matthew Ehret. Matthew is a polymath, so far as I can tell, journalist, researcher, historian, cartoonist, founder of the Canadian Patriot Review. His content is absolutely incredible and is really all over the place in a good way, in that I feel like there's a lot of depth and breadth that we could cover here. So I'm going to do my best. Matt, welcome to the show. How are you, man?
Hey, I'm good, Brett. How are you?
I'm great. I'm looking forward to our conversation today, and hopefully between the two of us, we can kind of rein things into something that is going to be somewhat coherent. And I mean that in a good way, because we as I've looked at more of your stuff, and as we were chatting off air, I think there's just so many threads we can pull on with what's going on in the world today. But I think just to sort of, first of all, my audience might not know who you are. So maybe you can give us the sort of potted bio of what you do, who you are, and sort of how you came to be here today chatting with me.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'll give a condensed version of that. I'm an author. Like you mentioned a few of the hats I wear in the very kind introductory remarks, and I started the Canadian Patriot Review as a geopolitical historical information platform back in 2012. While I was still at that time a volunteer, a permanent like a full-time volunteer with the LaRouche organization. It was called the Schiller Institute, and they had a small little office in Canada. That's where I was born and currently live. And I began to work with them. And it involves a lot of activism, a lot of table organizing, talking to strangers about provocative things, stopping the New World Order. Very difficult concepts to try to introduce to normies going to work or school. And so I found myself and a few of the other younger members increasingly frustrated trying to figure out, well, what is this thing that we're operating in called Canada? Because it's an American organization. We're talking about American issues, but we live in a monarchy. It seems like there's I guess the problem that we had was that within. Have you ever looked at Lyndon LaRouche or the LaRouche organization's information or messaging and stuff over
No,
the
no,
years?
I haven't actually. No, no.
Okay. Well, Lyndon LaRouche, he's dead now. He died at 96 in 2019. He ran for the American presidency like 8 times. He was in the Guinness Book of World Records since the 70s. And if you read like most of his writings, as well as the organization that he started in the late 60s, are all available online. And when you read it, you can see that he was really at the vanguard, exposing the Rockefeller machinery, the British Empire, fifth columnists embedded inside of the United States and various other countries of the world, represented by interests like the Rockefeller organization and others, way back before it was popular,
Hmm.
and doing it in a politically potent manner. And the guy rose and became the advisor to several governments in the 1970s and 80s. It's quite astounding what he
Cool.
was able to
Wow.
do. And I thought I was a very informed person um, in 2005, 2006. And when I had first encountered some representatives who, again, were doing street organizing, and I was having a cigarette after work on my break, and I was looking for somebody to talk to, and one of their signs provoked me because I was also looking into Freemasonry, the New World Order, and all of these things back then. And I was like, oh, okay, I can have an entertaining smoke break now. So I was chatting with this person, and they were telling me all this stuff about this old guy they were working with. And I was like, how do I not know this person? Like, if they've been around this many decades doing all of these things, how do I not know? Um, and then I started getting a sense of just the potency of the policies, the general philosophy of that was more than just politics. And so it provoked me quite a bit, and it really was a very rewarding experience of just following through on the curriculum. So LaRouche had a scientific curriculum for younger members at the time, in which when I began to volunteer, I got to take part in basically what was essentially looking for people who made great discoveries and reading their original writings. That was the essential
Oh,
idea.
wow. Okay.
Yeah, it was cool, right?
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
don't read about Kepler. Don't read like we know that Kepler made these discoveries, but instead of reading about him, just read his writings. They're available. Like here's, this you can go and pick up the Harmonies
Yeah.
of the World by Kepler, and he tells you exactly what his mind is doing as he's transforming his thoughts from ignorance into knowledge of these universal laws of planetary motion that involve, when you actually read his writings, an understanding of musical scales, the proportions, geometric proportions that shape the relationships of the different notes on hard and soft musical scales that he then sees as embedded within space-time that shapes the tempering of the orbits of the planets, which his that's not there in the way we are taught Kepler's laws in school. We're just taught a formula, and all of this substance has been removed. So this was something that was really, again, gratifying. And then you could start seeing, okay, well, what was Kepler doing in the political domain? Because he was also advising generals. He was trying to put an end to the 30 Years' War. He was like probably murdered. He was carrying out battles with his living nemesis, who were representatives of the Rosicrucian Black Magician tradition, trying to co-opt science in his day. And he's declaring war on people like Robert Flood in this book. Robert Flood being one of the key, John Dee, Francis Baconite Rosicrucians of England, trying to say this is what science is. It's channeling demons from the ether through scryers and numerology, and
wow.
And so you start seeing that there's this whole incredibly interesting drama shaping the unified growth of scientific discoveries and their suppression, as well as political discoveries and their suppression at the same time. Yeah. So anyway, I found myself a little bit frustrated because I was still in Canada. LaRouche is talking about the still existent British Empire, and yet nobody did the work to figure out, well, how does it express itself within this weird monarchy of the North? So I put myself to work to try to do some of that, to make my ability to communicate with my fellow Canadians a little bit easier. And I couldn't get anything published anywhere, though the discoveries were pretty exciting. Yeah. So I resolved to just make my own platform called the Canadian Patriot, which turned into a few books, a whole book series on the untold history of Canada. And then more books were added as more discoveries were added. And increasingly now I work with my wife, Cynthia, who is also an amazing writer. And we run the Rising Tide Foundation together in Canada, more cultural, educational material. And we recently got into making movies too, so turning a lot of our research into documentaries with a friend of ours who's a very talented filmmaker, Jason Dahl. And so yeah, we're trying to wear a lot of hats.
Cool. Hey, I love it. Yeah. I love it. I wear a lot of hats too, so I can totally relate to what you're talking about. But something you said, I love the whole idea of actually reading original works, because there's a few people out there that are not in the same space that you're in necessarily in terms of subject matter, but that have also gone and reread these old books, the original, and sort of looked at what was going on at the time and all that. And it makes you wonder when you look at the education system today, whether it's school, whether it's universities and whatever, and how much of this is just curated. And, here's the Cliff Notes kind of thing, and off you go, and of course, maybe we'll work our way into propaganda and some of these other things later. But, I think that in today's society, certainly people have lost all context of many things, not just Kepler's work, but of, think of how many things we've lost over maybe just 3 or 4 generations, you know what I mean? Like back in the day, it was common that everyone knew perhaps how to grow some food. Everyone knew how to sew. Everyone knew how to do these basic things. And today, we're under threat where children are losing the ability to even write with a pen. You know what I mean? So it does. Yeah. It puts everything into a very interesting context, especially when you look at the online space and everything is so heated and everything is so polarized. And it's like people don't really know, like on a foundational level, what they're talking about half the time. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. No, it freaks me out as well. And even just, Well, first of all, on one point, just sticking with the reading
Hmm.
source material thing, I'm just going to show you quick. Well, you can see there's a lot of books in my background, right?
Oh
Like,
yeah, yeah,
and a lot of those books, you got the collected works of Lincoln, collected works of Ben Franklin, Erasmus. A lot of those books I got from school libraries that were throwing them in the garbage.
wow,
Believe it or not, I was working for about a year at a university in Montreal, and I was just walking home, and all of a sudden there were like the entire like hallway. They left all. They basically emptied out all of the books that were touching on irrelevant dead white European males mostly. Although there were some black people too. There's Frederick Douglass's writings, the freed slave who ended up advising Abraham Lincoln. His works were also dumped in there, so it wasn't just isolated to just blacks,
yeah,
white people.
yeah,
But they were giving people who were students or workers at the college one last chance to just take these books home before they were all going to be shredded to make more space in the library for people to do like yoga or something. And I like I was partially really happy because it's like these are gold, better than gold, and I was like
yeah,
carrying hundreds of pounds of books home. And but also very sad because I know that this is happening in libraries and schools all over the Western world with the
hmm,
logic that that's being promoted. Like the logic is, well, everything is scanned. Everybody has the internet and can go to archive.org, right? And everything is digitized. So why do we need physical books anymore? And it's like, well, okay, sure, but you realize that archive.org is run by a transhumanist who believes in transhumanism
yeah,
and at any point could unplug. Like, why do we assume that that's a forever thing? I mean, you could just, that's like the easiest way to burn down, like the new Library of Alexandria burning down might just be a reset,
yeah,
somebody switching on and off a,
yeah,
the hosting service and it's gone. Um, so there's that. The other thing is like nobody's learning cursive anymore. So young people in their 20s are not learning how to write in cursive. So that means they can't read source material of their own family, or even if they wanted to do original research in archives, they can't do
hmm,
it because they don't know. It's like hieroglyphics when they read the letters of people living in the 19th century or even 20th century in many cases. So they can't do research anymore. And then the other thing, like you were saying, yeah, like practical skill sets.
yeah,
When I was in home economics in high school, it was already bad. There was no shop, there was no carpentry options. And
yeah.
I'm not the youngest thing, but I mean, but it was already really bad. I think we were making Pillsbury pastries, right? Like just that was what we did. Like
Oh my gosh.
like how useless is this?
Yeah,
So yeah, the practical life skills are really, really disappearing by design. So people are becoming more dependent. They're not sovereign. So if you're not sovereign, you need a zookeeper to manage you because you can't manage yourself. So
yeah,
of
yeah,
course,
yeah.
there's going to be some happy globalists there to provide the security that you definitely need because you can't do any of the basic human things for yourself anymore. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, and I think this is the overarching sort of sentiment that we can glean if we just zoom out, is that the whole purpose is to make you more and more dependent on the government. We can see that in every facet of our lives, right? It's like pay more taxes and we'll give you more stuff, quote unquote. And you just see, that's what it is. It's full dependence, grind you down, grind you down. Now you need more, more and more support kind of thing. But, I don't want to linger on that point too much, just in the interest of time, because I do know that you have potentially a bit of a hard stop today. I want to get into some of the nitty gritty here. And I think a good place for us to start, you mentioned it in your opening, the history of Canada. And I think one of the questions that has sort of certainly been going on in my orbit, let's put it that way, and it's not a new question. It's something that sort of ebbed and flowed over the years. I too was into a free man on the land about 15 years ago. I was looking into all that stuff and common law and some of these things. And I think that a conversation that's now sort of resurfaced quite a bit is Canada a sovereign nation, or is Canada a corporation? And I think, we have to sort of trace back our founding documents back to the British North America Act. So perhaps we can start there, or prior if you want. I'll hand the mic over to you and go for it.
yeah. I think that's a perfectly great, like a wide open question, and it's always that choice we always have to make whenever because we're context guys.
Hmm.
And as a context person, you're like, okay, we can start there, but that thing that we're going to start with is still being shaped by a thing before that and outside of
Totally.
that. So let's talk
Yeah.
about that. And then where do you stop, right? So you always have
Yeah.
to make that choice.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I guess, yeah, the BNA Act is a good starting point. And sure enough, that is for those who don't know, and if they're not Canadian, I'm sure they don't know, or they probably don't know that the equivalent or the thing that Canadians have been led to believe is their constitution is known as the British North America Act of 1867. It was written while the Civil War was still raging in 1864. It was drafted at a booze-filled orgy fest in the Maritime provinces. Seriously, like it was record numbers of booze drank during that weird party, and the Civil War again. It was becoming clear in the minds of the grand strategists of the British Empire was that it was likely that the dissolution of the Union that the British Empire had put so much effort into manufacturing over the previous decades leading up to the Civil War was not going to happen. The plan wasn't working out as desired. And so a new game had to be put into motion. A new scenario had to be brought into play. And that scenario had to encompass the fact that the representatives of Lincoln's America, which I alluded to Frederick Douglass as one man, but you had William Seward, Charles Sumner, you got Henry C. Carey. Like there's a large network, including a network people who were very active, who had attained political power within the Dominion of Canada before it was a Dominion, who wanted to use the weakness of the British Empire at that time and the strength of the American Republic, which was very different from the type of imperial republic that has done so much damage to the world after World War II. It was a very different quality than being expressed. And those people wanted to take the advantage of the Union's survival to declare Canada a free and independent republic in some cases. Other groups wanted to join the USA. In no case did the British Empire continue to exert influence in North America, which was a major strategic beachhead to carry out operations to prevent the US and the Russians from cooperating, as has been the historic tendency since 1776 of US-Russian friendship. The Russians even saved the USA during the Civil War itself by Alexander II sending his naval fleet as a sign of an alliance between Lincoln and Russia to say that if the imperial powers of England and France officially intervene into the Civil War on the side of the South, then that will be war with Russia. So there were many points of friendship. And obviously, the extension of Lincoln's transcontinental railway that was being built up during the Civil War, the idea of extending that through British Columbia on the West Coast, through Alaska, that the Russians had just sold or were preparing to sell to the Americans. It was still Russian during the Civil War, but they sold it in 1867. That was going to extend through the Bering Strait to provide for an economic foundation of trust building, of just win-win cooperation, and a replacement of the imperial systems of control that had shaped humankind for thousands of years. So that Canada real estate was very important to prevent that type of emergence of a more mature type of human society to ever occur. So anyway, the North American Act was drafted at that time. It was finally passed as an act of parliament in 1867, and it enshrined a confederation of the North around the idea of preserving the interests of the British Empire, which is by literally what it says our mandate is, to promote the interests of the British Empire in our Constitution. That's our purpose.
Yeah.
It also codefines the idea of rights under a fallacious notion. The wording that was used indicates that those rights that appear to be given to Canadians are given. They're not inalienable. It's intrinsically acknowledged that they're given by the crown, by the monarch. And the crown is defined as the fount of all honors. So all authority for law within the paradigm of this imperial system emanates from the institution of the crown per se, and whichever individual hereditarily is sitting there at any given moment, and the associated shadow government built up around that institution is going to define what is good, what is bad, what is your right, what is not your right. Can a right be given? Or if it can be given, it can thus be taken away, because a right is treated like an object, and it's not that.
Yeah.
A right is not that. So it's very different from the U.S. Constitution, and I encourage people, students of history, to really just take those two constitutions and just compare them and do the exercise yourselves to see how they're different, but they really are. And so from there, we were given a set of fallacies upon which other fallacies, like the Westminster Act in the 1930s or 1932, was built on top of that. And then the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982 was another add-on or another appendix to that Constitution that, again, just simply added more definition of what rights are, but always with that core set of fallacies at the heart that were never corrected. And we've seen how malleable it all is, how non-intrinsic all of these things are when we have a crisis, like was done during COVID. And all of a sudden people don't have rights anymore, and their bank accounts can be frozen, and the Constitution is kind of, there's loopholes built into the Constitution that allow for that forever. So that was one of those things. Yeah.
So I mean, so super interesting, and a couple of points to sort of tack on and get your thoughts on. My understanding is that the BNA Act was something that was actually done in British Parliament. Is that correct? So
Yes.
this was not something that was sort of like, hey, everyone, Canadian citizens or Canadian people, we would love to get your opinion on this. Can we all have a vote? Can we ratify this? That never happened, right? This was simply the Crown saying, all right, we've chatted over here, and we're now going to sort of foist this upon you, right? We all agree that this is the best thing for you. So that's one thing is, that's my understanding, is it was never really ratified by the people of Canada themselves. Second, this whole idea of a de facto versus a de jure government, you know what I mean? So when people think of government, they think of, this is a government that's working for the people. It's by the people. It's for the best interests of the people. And then when you actually look at it, it's more of a de facto type of government where it's like, well, hang on a second. How come they're listed as a corporation in the US? That's kind of weird. And why is the Crown considered a corporation as well? And so you start getting into it, and you mentioned that in some of your remarks that I guess these inalienable rights, people think we have these inalienable rights, and that is what is being sort of protected and safeguarded by the government. But in actual fact, that's not the case at all. It's more statutory law that has just sort of kept on going over the years. And so it really brings into question this whole idea of Canada as a sovereign nation versus Canada as a corporation, and how we're being governed, right? You mentioned the Freedom Convoy and that sort of stuff, and the Charter of Rights, is another one. And it was kind of interesting during the pandemic, it was like, people are like, hey, the charter. And it's like, well, the charter can be usurped if there's an emergency. So there you go. Sorry about that. And it's like, well, who gets to decide what's an emergency? The same
exactly.
people governing you, Yeah.
Absolutely.
So the other thing that we don't need to get into this unless you would like to, is something I wrote in a recent article. Is just, this idea that when we're born and we're given birth certificates and SIN numbers and these types of things, the all caps letter, the legal fiction registers you essentially as a corporation. And so where we find ourselves now is we've got the Corporation of Canada, right? And then the Corporation of Matthew and the Corporation of Brett and so forth. And what we're engaged in is legal contracts, is corporate contracts, to put it simply. And so again, it's sort of like what's happening with our inalienable rights at that point. You know what I mean? Like, how are those being taken care of? And are they? Let's put it that way. Because
I'll
go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll touch on the first point a little bit more, to add a bit more coloring to it. As far as I'll speak to the Canadian case. Many Canadians think that they live in a democracy. That's, if you ask them, that's the general opinion or consensus. And they think of the institution of the monarchy as a symbolic thing that it carries with it simply no power whatsoever. It's just a nice sentimentality of the past, maybe, It gives you warm, fuzzy feelings, a reminder that you're not American, maybe, because a lot of Canadians have been really conditioned to take pride in not being American. That's been one of the concerted agendas of those architects of our school system and of our history books over many generations.
Yeah.
But when you actually start digging, like putting on the weird glasses, as I call it, you allow the weird filter,
Yeah.
polarized lens to come in. You start seeing that, okay, with an appreciation of this historic New World Order agenda, that's not a new thing. It goes back a long time as an unbroken, continuous process of creating a world governed by hereditary institutions, mystery cults, superstitious slaves, and underpopulated human cattle under techno-feudalism. That's not a new agenda. That desire's been there in an unbroken manner. And then you can sort of revisit, what is the origins of Canada? What are the where does policy come from, domestic or foreign, within any Commonwealth? I would say any member of the British Commonwealth. And you start seeing that, no, there's actually the elected component of the government is far less influential than we are led to believe. And in fact, when you start appreciating these institutions, which even professional poli-sci professors that I've spoken to are ignorant of, such as the Privy Council, the Privy Council Office, the Governor General's Office, the Lieutenant Governors, the Order of Bath, these monarchically appointed Masonic orders. That in the case of Canada, you have the Knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, sort of the Anglican iteration of the Knights of Malta, which is extremely influential, both in the civil service control mechanisms as well as in the private sphere, within the organized crime networks as well, that have been built up carefully, not as something outside of the political or intelligence agencies, but as a component thereof, those Freemasonic political intelligence agencies, in all countries, whether the Sicilian Jewish triad, KMT mafia operations, they're all part of the same carefully organized, necessary component of the international shadow empire. You're like, oh, okay, no, the thing about Canada is that there are little bursts. There are examples of these wonderful little bursts of amazing freedom-loving patriots who, from now and again, occasionally, not often, were able to break free of the system of control or bypass those anti-human forces and do good things. And oftentimes, not always, but often, those figures that have been either slandered or obscured out of our history books, when you actually look at them, they often died very premature deaths, or were simply ousted in soft coups for those who were able to survive. And I tried to outline as many examples I could find in my Untold History of Canada book series. Oftentimes, those few individuals that I found in Canada's history, Australia has a number of them as well. Really good men, really, really good men. Usually they're able to carry out, when they are effective to varying degrees in their ambition to coordinate, working for the benefit of the people. They're usually like getting the support of authentically Republican leaders like Charles de Gaulle of France, or John F. Kennedy, or Franklin Roosevelt, or Abraham Lincoln, who are giving the support that they need in order to do combat. But once a JFK or a Lincoln or an FDR is out of the picture, all of a sudden they're choked. They've got nothing. They don't have enough within the instruments that are provided to them within the Commonwealth structures themselves to do the fight on their own. And usually at that point, you see the sabotage accelerate. So that's an unfortunate thing. The other thing is that most of Canada is Crown land. So for those who don't know, 89% or 90% of the land of all of Canada, this giant land, is owned by the Crown. About 10% is privately owned, but 90 is Crown land.
Wow.
There's things like Crown estates, Crown corporations, most of the government. I mean, we've got a very highly bureaucratized civil service where, I mean, many of the public utilities authorities, the treasuries, the Bank of Canada, all of these things are Crown corporations. and as such are again legally under the possession of the crown institution, is more than the individual sitting there. So there's all of these things, and it's very
Yeah.
similar for New Zealand or for Australia or for any part of the English speaking Commonwealth with white people especially. But the Commonwealth itself is not that different. It still represents 21% of the world's surface area. A lot of the most useful instruments for wielding global control for bankers, a banking elite centered in the city of London, which is still today, as it was 300 years ago, a
Yeah.
central nervous system, or the central nerve center of global financial controls. That's about the same as it was during the British Empire. It's just that the British Empire rebranded itself, giving nominal political freedom to it, or independence to its captives, but never economic freedom. And it
Mm.
never left the USA. In fact, the pro-British element inside of the USA, which represented Wall Street, the Skull and Bones operations, the Scottish Rite operations, which are also very active in other parts of the world, but that was never American. That was always an agency that was committed to undoing the American Revolution and transforming the USA into a co-managerial empire with their British overlords that represented the old nobility that goes back to the Roman patrician class. Like it's unbroken inbred
Yeah.
control. So that's part of like the global system. And like I said, I think for me, my passion has been what keeps me, like what keeps my fire going, is studies of when the empire failed to achieve their ends, their obsessive objectives of actualizing here on Earth a feudal, depopulated New World Order, which they've tried on a number of occasions over the last couple of centuries. And whenever they've been subverted by smart people who are able to understand and organize creatively, those are the things that I have given my time and efforts and passion to really exploring how that happens, so that I can, look back to my current world, my current period in
Yeah.
history, with some educated insights into where are the weak spots of the empire, what are they afraid of, what sort of attributes of the human condition can possibly emerge that will bypass or subvert this depopulation agenda. So that's that. I encourage everybody. That's what when I've written my books and stuff, that's always in the top of my mind as the core lesson I'm trying to get people to walk away with,
Yeah. Well, and thank you so much for that. I mean, a lot to unpack, but I want to circle back to a couple of things you said. And I don't think people realize that there's still now, I mean, I was just researching for an article and that I'm writing, and, the monarchy and its influence still in the Commonwealth countries, and King Charles is still the monarch currently at time of recording of 15 Commonwealth countries. So, this, you speak about independence, and, you sort of wonder, like, independence in what respect, you know what I mean? Because it's not true independence. It's not full independence. And, when you look at the Five Eyes nations today, what are the Five Eyes nations? You've got Australia, you've got New Zealand, you've got the whole of the UK, Canada, and the US. So the US is a bit of an outlier there in some senses. All those other countries are all Commonwealth countries, that are, but not to, you touched on a couple of things that I would love to explore a bit more with you, which is this idea, you mentioned depopulation, New World Order type of events throughout history. And I think for a lot of people like right now, in the present time, they might not realize that these things have been tried before because people don't study history. So, we're looking at this now and we're going, I mean, holy crap, like, look at all the stuff that's going on. Like, our whole world is being turned upside down, and people who are aware of what's happening are starting to go, oh my gosh, we got outfits like the World Economic Forum. Like, what's the United Nations up to? Look at the World Health Organization. Like, they're changing all these policies and making all these rules up. And so what you've alluded to is the fact that these are not new things. I think we just have now different tools and different technologies at play and in our existence. But have you noticed any sort of common themes throughout history? Like, are there patterns where the same types of things happened? They were in the run-up to some of these attempts. Perhaps you want to speak to that a little bit more. Yeah?
Oh yeah, most certainly, dude. Yeah, absolutely. And again, for those who want to dig into that very potent question and how I address it in more detail, I guess on I wrote a series of books called The Clash of the Two Americas, volumes 1 to 4, and Revenge of the Mystery Cults, volumes 1 to 3, that are all available. So for people who are not satisfied with what I'm about to say, there's that to jump into.
Check the show notes.
Yeah, show notes, take notes. So what I'll say to that is, like, having done a fair bit of work on the Crusades, like, it's very common for people to sort of use the words since 9/11, especially, that it's the new Crusaders, the neocons, got their forever wars between the Christian and the Muslim worlds, by first, doing the false flag, the 9/11 operation that then justified this new sort of paradigm. If you ask people in the year 2000, would you give your consent to launching into regime change wars and bombing of Arab countries halfway around the world? Most Americans would say absolutely not. They had no desire for that at all. But you give them a trauma, a Pearl Harbor moment, which is what Richard Pearl and the other architects, or Wolfowitz and the other architects of the Project for New American Century document, the manifesto of the neocons. They literally call for the creation of a psychologically traumatic event that would allow for the consent of the governed to promote this new policy of forever wars, as well as implicitly the type of security dragnet and surveillance state that was what emerged out of the Patriot Act as well, that John Ashcroft wrote. And so it's common to call these guys new crusaders, which they are. They are that. But the weight of those words is not properly felt, I think, for those who often bandy about those terms. Because when you actually look at the original Crusades, that was it's highly useful, especially to understand the formation of the state of Zionism, or the state of Israel, the Zionist ideology, the Christian Zionist ideology, the rapture Armageddonist Christian evangelical ideologies that were groomed in order to bring about this geopolitical effect that we're currently now seeing unfolding, especially centered around the idea of the reconstruction of Solomon's Temple, that I think a lot of astute analysts and just citizens have noticed is a big, strange obsession amongst many Christian Zionists in America, as well as figures around Benjamin Netanyahu, who seem to be obsessed with not just restoring Solomon's Temple, the third temple, along with the mass murder, like a ritual sacrifice of these red heifers.
Yeah.
But also restoring this idea of a new kingdom of Jerusalem that somehow was promised, to the Jews, to have their own kingdom at the end times, wherein the Messiah will come. So you've got this stuff that's animating the strategic thinking of many, many bad actors, and you're like, where is this coming from? What is the through line that ties all of this together? The ancient Solomon's Temple, right? The first one, the second one, when the Jews were in Babylon. Like, what was that all about? Right? Why? What was going on when the second one was destroyed after the Roman Jewish wars in whatever 70 AD? Well, what ties all of this together? And you start seeing, okay, you have people like Julian the Apostate, the last sort of Helios man god figure who was doing the most work to revive the ancient mystery cults and smother Christianity in 360, who had begun work on rebuilding Solomon's Temple for the third time. He's a highly cherished figure in the pantheon of like deities. This Julian the Apostate, by many occultists, Aleister Crowley, Carl Jung, many of the modern occultists who have been playing a role in shaping our modern world adore in a strange way the figure of Julian the Apostate. So why? What about the Templars, right? So like the Crusades themselves were unleashed onto the world in the late 11th century, like 1098. And it took a few centuries to finally get that going. There was efforts already in the 8th century by high-level occultists operating through the papacy, through the Vatican, or at the time Rome, as well as Venice, as well as Amalfi, as well as even some operators within Constantinople of the Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire had become the Byzantine Empire by that time. And so you had these occultists that were already trying to manufacture this new forever religious war ideology, because the problem that they had was that human beings, being human, were problem solvers first. And you had leading representatives from the Christian world of the Carolingian dynasty working to find peace and cooperative policies with representatives of the Muslim world, at the time the Abbasids, of Harun al-Rashid, his father, his grandfather, his son. That whole network were building all sorts of wonderful economic and cultural policy sharing alliances. You had many leading Jewish intellectuals as well, helping to build houses of wisdom in Baghdad, where Jews and Christians and Chinese and Muslims were all doing translations together, astronomy together, writing poetry, sharing each other's languages. It was really quite the robust cultural dynamic. And a lot of this was given vitality through the revival at the time of the Silk Road, which had gone fallow. It had collapsed when the Han Dynasty had collapsed in the 2nd century AD, but it was revived in around 680 under the Tang Dynasty, which began to build active relationships and communion between the Chinese, the Muslim, the Christian worlds, and the Jewish worlds. So it was very difficult to spark these wars when you had such a vibe, in play.
Yeah,
But it finally worked out. There was a lot of machinations. I've written a few chapters on this in Clash of the Two Americas, Volume 4. And finally, the way they were able to do that, to get that forever war, involved the creation of several very, I would say, satanic Gnostic orders that were masquerading as Christian but were not really Christian. The Templars and the Knights Hospitaller being two of the dominant ones. There was another one called the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre, which, in the case of the Knights Templar, had as their home base Solomon's Temple, the Solomon's Mines. That was their home base, where they were carrying out, as was discovered later on through whistleblowers, their rituals to Baphomet, an androgynous demon god, which involved sacrifice, a lot of other things, a lot of perverse sexual practices as well, that were part of their weird prayers to their dark Manichaean divinity. And they would work in tandem with the Order of Malta, another, like I mentioned, a very powerful order today. Both orders still exist under different iterations today in an unbroken continuity.
Wow.
And they were at the lower levels, they appeared to be rivals on the lower, like take, for example, the new Templars. After the Templars were broken up in that form, they went underground and appeared in several iterations in the centuries thereafter, one of which was the Rosicrucian movement, the speculative Freemasonry movement that the Rosicrucians created and then infiltrated other lodges, was another aspect of that. The Jesuits, as Albert Pike even talks about in Pride, is that the Jesuits were the revived Templars, but they were more disciplined this time. The Templars had controlled global banking, ports, international piracy trades. Like the idea of the skull and crossbones, it's a Templar symbol. Because the Templars, when you control crusades, which was going on for centuries, waging forever wars, is very lucrative. And if you have to get your mercenaries from point A to point B, which means controlling the ports of the Mediterranean. That's a lot of power. And so anyway, the Jesuits being another one. Now look today, right? We just had a Jesuit Pope who died. He was Pope Francis, very woke extremist on the one hand, and then now as a response, you have a new Pope who's really charming many of the right-wing conservative trad types because of his language that he's using, which sounds like a breath of fresh air compared to the left-wing Jesuit, i.e., New Templar extremist Pope. But he's also a member of the Order of Malta. He was initiated on February the 11th of 2025. So you see how this game of left and right is always played as controlled opposites, whereas on the inner initiated core, they're completely aware that they're on the same side. But for the rivals on the lower level, they're led to believe that they're rivals with each other. So the Templars disappear, and then most of their assets are then given over to the Knights Hospitaller, which become the Knights of Malta. So that's sort of how this game has been played. And I just see how, like whether it's the Bolshevik left extremists being funded by the Soroses out there that have pushed leftism from the JFK common sense, moral, pro-labor, anti-imperial state of mind, which was its historical, like, sane expression, to become now this absurd monstrosity of itself. And it's so extreme that it demands a right backlash, which is now creating something I'm watching it in front of my eyes. Such basically a tendency towards a controlled fascist response, which is exactly how they were able, like, that's why there's a lot of like Hitler revivalism, rehabilitation of Hitler, Nazis, who were all like the leading SS officers, by the way, were members of the Order of Malta, Galen, others. So you can see how this left-right game has been played, and they were made possible by the creation of the radical Bolshevik movement, this hyper-atheistic Bolshevik thing being funded by the same Rothschild, Warburg, Jacob Schiff bankers that were doing the Federal Reserve, financing the Bolshevik International, which then created a space for such a thing as National Socialism to emerge in various countries as a response to that. And I'm seeing the replication of that today. The thing that has always been the solution has been the human thing. Like that ability for humans to first look at themselves as humans first, and to cooperate on policies with people of another language, another ethnic group, another religion, based on the fact that we're all humans. We all want a better life for our kids, and let's have a conversation on that. And let's not worry about those details of like what we call God and what we, the different cultural quirks that separate us. But let's look at what unites us first, on a moral level, and make policy around that. And the oligarchy loses power. Whenever we don't do that, we become more divided, more easily conquerable, the oligarchy more stupid, and we forget our own traditions, and the oligarchy gains power. So that's like the formula I've noticed as a pattern.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. And I mean, it certainly seems like today there's polarizing narratives just constantly coming at us. Pick whatever topic it is you want, and it's just constantly divide. So I can see that the same thing as well. And what's interesting is you actually see, based on this whole we'll call it left-right dynamic that you've just outlined for us, you can actually see that become animated in the population as well, right? If you just take a look around on social media, you can see these things. When people go back 5-10 years ago, and people would say, "Oh my gosh, lefties are like this ... and right people are like this ... and they weren't really, like, at that time they weren't really. And now people are actually become manifest on the very thing that they thought that they weren't. You know what I mean? I can certainly see that. Now, I want to bring some of this into a modern context as well. And when I say modern, not 2025, but you jogged my memory, this whole idea of the illusion of a left-right, the illusion of choice, the illusion of democracy, these types of things. And I can't help but think of the Milner groups and the Fabians, right? I've never really spoken much about them publicly, but if you look at the origins of particularly the Fabians, you go back to the sort of, I guess, Karl Marx and communism, and then sort of Engels after that, and then you sort of go fast forward, Stalin, Lenin, and so forth. But the United Nations sort of plotted along with that as well, right? So their sort of foundational underpinnings are very much in alignment with some of these in terms of the manifesto and the ideas. And then you've got the Fabians, so far as I know, you probably know more, is that they realized that, if they wanted to take control of the political side of things, they had to actually infiltrate both sides of the aisle. They had to infiltrate both political parties. And so again, what we see in, today's world is we see, oh my gosh, the left, and oh my gosh, the right. And I've always, likened it to WrestleMania, right? They all beat the crap out of each other in the ring, and then they're having beers afterwards. You know what I mean? And so anyway, I don't know if you wanted to chat a little bit at all, or what your thoughts or knowledge is on the Fabians and that sort of thing, because it certainly is percolated into modern politics. That's for sure.
Yeah, man. Like, you can't really know properly anything causal of the 20th century if you don't really do a deep dive and appreciate what is the Fabian Society, why was it created, to what ends, and what has it done. If you don't do that, and also how does it interface as a in conjunction with its sister organization, the Roundtable Milner Rhodes Group, because they
Hmm.
both weave together in a similar manner as the Templar Hospitaller orders have woven together, often appearing to non-initiates to be somewhat rivals, but at the inner core, always being guided by the same common policy, in order to better help infiltrate everything that has influence within society, any institution, which both of them were mandated to do. And in that sense, you know, Cecil Rhodes, who laid out his manifesto for how his new order was going to unfold, explicitly stated that it should follow the Jesuit constitution. So he directly called for it to be modeled upon the Jesuits, upon his time in managing Rhodesia as a giant racist overlord, member of the Church of the British Empire. He donated much of the land of South Africa and Rhodesia as a whole to Jesuit churches that were very good, even though they were good lower level Jesuits. And just to be a little bit clear with the nuance that I'm using here, I want to get across that just because I'm very hard on the Jesuits doesn't mean that I'm saying that every Jesuit is bad. I'm saying that the Jesuit system seems to be organized in a somewhat Masonic arrangement involving degrees of initiation, constant testing,
Mm.
of recruits who, depending upon how they respond to their tests from their superiors, will either raise themselves to a higher position of authority in the chain of command or will not. They will be the Jesuits that got murdered by Archbishop Bergoglio while he was advising the military junta of Argentina in the 1970s under Operation Condor, that involved this Jesuit Archbishop Bergoglio, later known as Pope Francis, helping to provide the coordinates, the names, the details, the doxing of the lower level Jesuits that were working with the peasants in trying to fight these World Bank, IMF,
Mm.
American corporate interests that were supporting the military junta. And, many Jesuits who were not initiated were just good people trying to do good, were tortured, kidnapped, murdered, and there was enough of them. So what I'm saying is, you have good Jesuits who don't know what the game is. Just like you've got good members of the Order of Malta, you got good
Yeah.
Freemasons who just don't fully understand what the game is. They answered them. They gave the wrong answer. They gave the moral answer on the test, and they
Yeah.
thought they passed, and they didn't.
Yeah.
So all that to say, that's my nuance. So Cecil Rhodes was doing this. Now, the interesting thing is that the Fabians, also pro-eugenics, a pro-eugenics bunch of nobles, English nobles who hated humanity, centered around the figure of George Bernard Shaw and Beatrice and Sidney Webb, and later on joined by Alfred Mackinder and H.G. Wells and Annie Besant, who became the head of the Theosophists, sort of the spiritual think tank created by the British Empire to better try to undermine global spiritual traditions. So they were operating on all three levels: material, intellectual, spiritual warfare against humanity. At the same time, the empire thinks
Yeah.
very dynamically. They don't compartmentalize their thinking the way their victims have been conditioned to compartmentalize these different aspects of the human condition into different camps. They don't do that. So that's why the Fabians were created around the same time in 1884 out of the Fellowship of New Life. A lot of those same founding members were also Theosophists. The Theosophy organization was also created around that same time, by a bunch of occultists, 20 or so, but led by, at least nominally, the figure of Madame Blavatsky, also Colonel Alcott, William Quan Judge. Later on, like I said, Annie Besant becomes a leading figure who went from being a radical social Darwinian, eugenical materialist, feminist of the Fabian Society leadership to becoming all of a sudden this spiritualist channeler of ascended masters who runs the Theosophists, and then all of a sudden creates the outlet for political revolutionaries in India who are trying to fight the British Empire, and all of a sudden they create the India Congress Party, right, which is set up by a bunch of Theosophists and Fabians, and it continues to represent and capture all of that, the anti-imperial energy of Indians of all walks of life who think that all of a sudden this is their outlet, and it becomes very clear that that's a controlled pressure valve, which again Eddie Besant runs for many years. She's even training Gandhi earlier on. Gandhi is learning the Bhagavad Gita, how to read, how to interpret the Bhagavad Gita when he's a law student in London, going to Fabian Society seminars. So yeah, so, and I'm not saying that Gandhi's all bad, but he's certainly, there's a dimension of the guy, and yeah, there's a lot of bad. There's a lot of dark skeletons in this guy's closet. I'm just saying he's not like a Hitler type, but again, there's a lot more skeletons that I don't think he should be elevated. There's a reason why the Tavistock Clinic has in their headquarters a Gandhi statue in the center of the town of Tavistock, because he represents a sort of personality profile that they adore, that they would love be represented as an archetype for their victims who think that they're walking a free, loving, spiritual path, but actually are the perfect kind of people that will accept a cage that they can never understand what it is. So all that to say, there's that. Like, for example, side note, during the Bretton Woods conference, when the entire Indian delegation was at Bretton Woods in 1944 discussing like what will be the policy for India and for the world after the war is finished, all of the Indian delegates supported like liberation from the British Empire and an industrial policy to end poverty and to build a full spectrum economy around industrial progress and sovereignty. All of the Indian delegates unanimously supported this, except for one, which was Gandhi, who wanted to remain agrarian, underdeveloped, right? No advanced technology, because he had this, and the British love that. They love it. They love it. If that's your idea of having a free nation, is to reject technological progress, because that means you're never going to be able to have the real economic power to solve hunger, to stand on your own 2 feet. You'll always have a stronger power outside of your nation controlling those things, and the British love it. So all that to say, and that's why Vandana Shiva, who's I think representing the Gandhi archetype now, is praised so much as the guru of King Charles III. She even has her own statue in King Charles's little garden. She's advising him. He loves that sort of thing. So, because she's pushing policies that will ultimately demand global depopulation, even if people who are participating in those policies are not aware of it. So that gets us back to, okay, so that's what the Fabian Society and Roundtable movement, they would often collaborate together. Like the Canadian Fabian Society was set up by 6 Rhodes Scholars. That's
so Cecil Rhodes, basically. Yeah.
The Rhodes Scholars were people who got a brainwashing in Oxford under the trust, the money, of Cecil Rhodes's ill-begotten funds that were managed by Lord Milner and high-level initiates of the empire, in order to create a new mercenary class of ideologues who could then be sent back to different parts of the world that they were born into to facilitate with Fabian initiates from the London School of Economics, who would get their brainwashing in a special experience in the London School of Economics, and they would work together in different, as we saw with the Fabian Society of America being led by people like John Dewey, the educational reformer who was leading the American Fabians, Walter Lippmann, who was the patron of Edward Bernays and who oversaw the creation of the Rhodes Trust operation, or the big think tank in America known as the Council on Foreign Relations. That's the American branch of the Roundtable movement. The Roundtable movement being the name of the set of think tanks. There's one also in South Africa called the Royal Institutes for International Affairs. That was the Rhodes Milner think tanks to coordinate the behavior of all of the Rhodes Scholars and Crown Agents International to infiltrate and capture institutions in order to bring them back under the control of the British Empire, which was then known in the 19th century and before as the only expression of a one world government. It was the British Empire. So, that's the thing that we have at the heart of the deal. And this is at the heart of the the thing that murdered JFK, many of our great leaders, and that brought in a new paradigm that cherished reducing population growth in defense of nature instead of resisting imperialism in defense of humanity, which was the former, ethos, the moral ethos that made humanity viable for centuries before that. The new paradigm of the baby boomers and the paradigm shift that was unleashed with the help of a lot of CIA-funded and created drugs into North America and into the West was this new ethos that, no, humanity is actually a virus, or we are a cancer, and thus, if we want to be good, we should lessen our impact on nature and help Earth Mother Gaia as our new deity heal from the wounds of humanity, which is where the baby boomers that are currently in positions of high power, unfortunately, got their conditioning. Yeah. And a lot of this was overseen by social engineers who were Rhodes Scholars and Fabians.
Yeah. Well, man, you great segue into the United Nations, right? So, I mean, the United Nations, one world government, unite all the nations. And I started digging into some of their sort of founding documents. People like Dennis Meadows, who wrote the book Limits to Growth and these types of things, right? So you mentioned, the whole Gaia concept. The whole idea, I mean, we can see that with the climate change movement now, which is sort of really underpinning a lot of the technocratic side of things that we're starting to see, the fourth industrial revolution, technocracy, etc. But it's like the United Nations founding documents are very much this, like, Julian Huxley, right? It's this very spiritual, forget about religion, forget about Christianity, forget about these things, right? It's more this like this lofty kind of spiritual vibe, if you will. And as you said, it's all about like humans and nature, right? Humans and nature. And we are simply like, not the people telling you this because they're the good guys, right? It's everyone else. Yeah. We're all just like some kind of cancer on the earth. And we're seeing that nowadays. We're seeing that rhetoric play out everywhere. And I think the young people of today have no idea where the origins of all this stuff comes from. They don't understand that this is a long game that's been laid out over a very, very long time. And suddenly we find ourselves, people saying, well, the whole climate change thing, so climate change is, by definition, if the foundational concept of climate change is that we are responsible for ruining and damaging the planet, the logical conclusion is, well, if you get rid of all of us, then the planet will survive, right? Then the planet will be healthy, which is, again, I'm simplifying the whole thing, but that is really kind of what it is in a nutshell. So it's interesting to me, you've laid all of this stuff out from a historical context, from a background context, and let's talk a little bit about the modern context. Obviously, I've given the lay foundation here. Where do we see things like the World Economic Forum, the United Nations, these types of organizations now? They seem to me like to be the modern, the new modern manifestation, if you will, of some of these older ideas that have permeated through time.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a good question. Well, so the World Economic Forum was set up as sort of, I think, a good way to think about its origins and purpose is as the junior branch of the Bilderberg Group. And Prince Bernhard, unreconstructed Nazi SS officer from the House of Orange, was the founder of the Bilderberg Group, lifelong friend and collaborator of Prince Philip Mountbatten, the nephew and disciple of the original Lord Mountbatten, who was the Viscount overseeing, the partitioning of India. Prolific pedophile, mass rapist of young boys, that Lord Mountbatten, and just slimy character. Anyway, he conditioned his young nephew and positioned him to be the breeding horse for Queen Elizabeth from the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. And so in 1954, he created, with the advice of people like C.D. Jackson, very high-level psychological warfare, social engineer, worked at the OSS, later on became the head of Time Lifes with Henry Luce. They co-created with Alan Dulles, and Kissinger was on the ground floor of this in 54. The Bilderberg Group as a coordinating committee to organize through the technique of private finance and private corporations, the reconquest of nation states that would involve people working in infiltrating the nations from the bottom up, as well as managing it from the top down through the Bilderberg Group. And Prince Bernhard ceded the original capital for the financing of the big Club of Rome operation that was brought into the earliest meetings of the World Economic Forum in 1973. In 1971, when the World Economic Forum was set up, it had a slightly different name. I'm forgetting it now. Klaus Schwab was just, I think, a young, sociopathically oriented student of Henry Kissinger's at a CIA-funded international studies department at Harvard University. And he had the sort of ambition and skill set and psych profile to be a useful cardboard cutout front man for this thing. The Club of Rome was also being co-funded or set up at the same time by Sir Alexander King, who was a cyberneticist and the lead director of the British Empire Scientific Directorate. He was the manager of UNESCO, not UNESCO, the OECD for a period, and brought in cybernetics planning to govern the administerial sort of operating systems of NATO, of the OECD, of various governments. And cybernetics is simply just a system that it's like the science of control. So it's a science based on the idea of managing every system that is ponderable, whether a biological organism, cellular system, solar system, atomic systems, physics, biology, you name it, but especially economic systems, as parts that are the sum total of, or they're wholes that are made up of parts that are highly compartmentalized. So you overinflate each department within NATO or the OECD or within the Department of Education or whatever you want to do. You overinflate it bureaucratically. You hyper-specialize people to work within those departments in such a manner that their minds are broken through the conditioning of their education to become just basically cogs in a machine whose minds can't comprehend what the other departments are doing that are part of the machinery. And in such a system, you have only the helmsman, as the theory goes, the helmsman being the initiated executives that control the nervous system, the central command structure, that are permitted the right to see the whole as the sum of parts which they believe it is. So that's a great way of just carrying out the infiltration of a system is cybernetics. So that's what Alexander King was doing when he set up the Club of Rome. He was also being funded at by the Rockefeller family in that original meeting in Italy that set up the Club of Rome. Prince Bernhard, who was also financing with Julian Huxley the new environmentalist movement by his co-creation with Prince Philip and Julian Huxley, the eugenicist, the president of the Eugenics Society. They were creating the World Wildlife Fund for Nature in 1962 together, all three. They created Prince Bernhard's money directly and capital directly funded the third World Economic Forum conference that brought in the Club of Rome's limits to growth, garbage computer models into the entirety of the third conference, which sort of set the tone for what the operating system, what the game was going to be played and what the rules were going to be of the game. And people like Maurice Strong was a high-level Bilderberg steering committee member during that time that worked very hard to transform the UN already had problems from its get-go, but I would say in my research, it wasn't intrinsically a bad thing at the start. So when you read the original UN Charter, it was not based on a world government idea. It was based, that's why Article 2, Article 3 of the UN Charter has been, if you read the writings of people who are enemies of humanity, they really don't like some of those articles, because in those articles, the original ones, and they're still there, but they're not really abided by, it enshrines the sovereignty of the nation state as primary to every other consideration, legal or political, imaginable. So it enshrines the idea of the sovereign nation state as the causal nexus of any type of international policy. It also calls for the illegalization of aggressive wars from one power to another. So you can wars from defense are one thing, but aggressive wars are made illegal, which is why later on it took them many years, but they had to finally do the responsibility to protect protocol under Tony Blair and Dick Cheney or Tony Blair and company, which was a Fabian initiative in 1998 to say, no, we need to supersede those articles that prevent initiating wars based on the idea. Like,
they're old. They're old. They're outdated. Yeah.
Yeah, and we gotta exactly, like, look what happened to Rwanda. We could have stopped the genocide in Rwanda if we were only allowed to have a UN police force that had the power to go in and ignore the sovereignty of the Rwandan people. But ignoring the fact that you had the same CIA MI6 operatives lighting the fires of that conflict to create the genocide that they wanted as an excuse to then say, hey, we need a new type of, look at Saddam Hussein, he's so bad. If we only had a power legally to go in and do that, we could save the people of Iraq, and we could stop 9/11s from happening ever again. And it's like, well, you're ignoring a lot to make that argument.
Yeah, manufacturing consent, basically, and getting the buy-in, right? Which is what we're seeing today in a modern context. I mean, across...
Totally, yeah. So all let's say, like, Maurice Strong played a big role in creating in these things like the UN conferences on population control in 1972, and again, the second one in 1992. He oversaw the creation of the Earth Charter with Stephen Rockefeller in 1994, and Mikhail Gorbachev was the third author of the Earth Charter that was part of the Agenda 21 operation that gave rise to the Sustainable Development Goals. So what they were trying to do is to say we need to supersede the UN Constitution, which had too many problematic elements within it that gives nation states too much power, with something new that actually gives us an ability to have an enforcement capability amongst a new international entity that we'll call like UN 2.0 or something, that now has like a military enforcement mandate around forcing nations to constrict their carbon output in order to save nature from humanity. All of this stuff is like where that stuff's coming from, I think, you know?
Yeah, so it's sort of like creating a lot of these problems. I mean, that's what we see in the world today is destabilization, right? So creating more chaos, and then out of that will come order, you know, the new order. And of course, that's more of the technocratic type of order. But so in today's world, in 2025, at time of recording, you know, I want to just fast forward a little bit, and you know, we've got Mark Carney at the helm here, and Mark Carney is directly associated with many of these organizations that we've been chatting about for the last 10 minutes. You know, we've got the United Nations. He's been involved with them. He's been involved with the World Economic Forum, the Bank of International Settlements. Obviously, he's a central banker, so Bank of Canada, Bank of England as well. And the list goes on and on and on. You know, I've sort of briefly done some coverage on that as well, but I know you've done like a lot of stuff. So I think what I like about our conversation today is actually, and I know it's been very dense and there's a lot of threads to pull on, but it lays a very, very deep and long background in the foundational work to sort of how we got here today. And I think when people look at Mark Carney and they go, oh my gosh, here's this guy coming in to save the day. He's got the resume. He's a business guy. He can help save the planet because he's got all the climate financing figured out. He can deal with Trump because he's a very stately kind of guy, and so on and so on. And, you know, here's your elbows up crowd coming in and like, oh my gosh, thank heavens, you know, finally someone's here. You know, exit left, Justin Trudeau, clown boy, and enter right, you know, a more serious guy. And I think people don't realize that, you know, this guy is not someone who got choppered in to save the day for us. You know, he's actually been carefully groomed from a very young age. You know, you mentioned Oxford earlier, and you mentioned some of these sort of more mysterious organizations, and he is actually tethered to many of these organizations. You know, Chatham House is another one. So perhaps let's sort of like talk a little bit more about, and you know, let me know about your timing. But just Mark Carney, I think, and where Canada is at right now with some of the things we've spoken about. You know, how do you see him? Like, what's his agenda? Let's maybe just throw that out there.
Well, he's a creature of the system, I think, in its worst expression. And as you alluded to, He's the first prime minister that we've ever had who has been both a governor of the Bank of Canada, a governor of the Bank of England, which means you have to be very highly vetted. His brother was also I think the CFO or the manager of Prince William's estates, which is a very influential position considering William is scheduled to be the new king. So he's a handler of William. That's his brother. So they have high-level family connections into whatever this thing is that has taken control of the Catholic or the Anglican Church, I should say, or maybe it's always been there. Might have actually correct me. I correct myself. This thing that's always been there. But also that has infiltrated the Vatican Church as well. I would hold on to that statement too, because there has been an integration of the Vatican through the Jesuit takeover of the Vatican and the Anglican Church, both of those institutions, by the way, were created in the same year in 1534. Probably not a coincidence, and have very similar sort of mandates. Okay, so Carney is the first also Prime Minister of Canada who has been a president of Chatham House of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, which I believe he still is. There's four presidents.
I think he recently stepped down. Very recently.
Okay, he might have stepped out. He might have gotten rid of those positions to become prime minister. So okay, fine. But that is that's the controlling mechanism behind the Council on Foreign Relations, which even Hillary Clinton had said was the mothership, describing its influence over Washington and Washington policy. And she was not lying. So the mother of the mothership. He's also somebody who has been proud to call himself the eco-warrior of central bankers. He is the architect of the bail-in regime that was set up in 2010 and embedded into various governing bank acts across the transatlantic to allow legally for the confiscation of people's savings in the context of another systemic bank crisis, which will happen. So it's there in order to be used. He's the architect of that with Mario Draghi, both of whom were groomed in Goldman Sachs as investment bankers, themselves during those positions overseeing the growth of the very derivatives time bomb that they set up to explode. So you got that. He's also, one of the co-architects of the climate compact for central banks and bankers. So the idea of creating a new fund, an ecological fund with a new climate index for environmental natural assets.
Yes. Yeah.
You start monetizing oxygen and chlorophyll and different ecosystems of the earth that they want to make as their new value system for the post globalized world order, that will be reset in their minds. They want the new system to have values on activities that are going to reduce human impact. So, and he talks about that in his 2019 50 Shades of Green program that he unveiled at the Jackson Hole Central Bankers Conference, where he called for, and he outlined it in quite a good amount of detail in the written document as well, how the new type of system of economic management that was really defined by, I think, his spiritual father, Maurice Strong, but that he added a lot of detail to, will be based upon providing loans or giving preferable premiums on interest, or even just rejecting loans and rejecting giving insurance, rejecting giving insurance to companies, which will have the effect of increasing our carbon footprint, and only allowing incentives to those activities that will kill people. But he doesn't use those words. He says reduce our footprint or our carrying capacity. So he's like really behind a lot of these worst things that I've ever seen. He was also a Bilderberg Group steering committee member.
Correct.
As well for a long time. Worked very closely with Chrystia Freeland. He's the godfather, or he's the godfather of one of her children. That Chrystia being the Rhodes Scholar from Oxford as well. He's put one of his own kids, ideologically, you could see where he stands by the fact that he encouraged one of his own kids to get Tavistocked and regendered in the Tavistock Clinic while he was in England. He's also very much tied in with the Bronfmans. So you have the whole Bronfman operation that created what's known as Brookfield Asset Management. That's the merger of the Edgar Peter Bronfman Asset Management consortium, which merged with Brascan, the public utilities controlling company that is also a Bronfman-run operation that still today controls an inordinate amount of public utilities of Brazil. It was known as the Brazilian Light and Traction Company before it became Brascan, and those two companies merged, Brascan and Edper, and they became Brookfield in 2004. So you've got him tied to Stephen Bronfman. Bronfman being still the what do you call it? A leading figure. He's got the official position of he manages basically the money of the Liberal Party. He was a major handler of Justin Trudeau, very close friends with Mark Carney.
Okay.
And this brings him directly into the whole Epstein networks as well. You know, him and Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. So Carney, his wife, Ghislaine Maxwell, were friends hanging out with each other in England. So you got all sorts of degrees of connection with pure insipid evil that this guy seems to be a part of, and definitely not. And if you ask me what I see him doing, it's generally anything pragmatically necessary to both, number one, keep Canada and both locked into the system of British imperial controls at all costs, to continue Canada's legacy as a wedge, preventing any type of Arctic development strategy from ever happening. Number three, absorb British imperial influence to the continent as a whole, ideally by absorbing the USA into the British imperial fold. Four, promote a revamped version of Elon Musk's grandfather's Technate of the Americas, which was the agenda of Technocracy Inc. back in the 30s to create a North American technate. And Elon Musk's grandfather, Joshua Haldeman, was a major leader of that institution when he was working with a bunch of Fabians and Rhodes Scholars in the 30s in Canada, which has been revived in the form of what's known as the North American Union. That was set up by a think tank called Canada 2020, which had several privy councillors, two of whom were leading the task force to create the North American Union, of which Mark Carney's wife, Diane Carney, is a leader of that think tank, Canada 2020. So it's a rebranded version of the Technate that would involve an expanded control grid over the USA that would be reabsorbed, maybe after an economic crisis, maybe after a bit of a cataclysmic civil war, perhaps, that would have a more mushy, soft, desperate, weakened USA taken down from its arrogance and reabsorbed under the fold of the more stable British Empire. That's one thing that Mark Carney is definitely committed to. Probably also weakening the Russia-China alliance. I see Carney as despite being overall committed to an eco-depopulation agenda, I would not be surprised if he, for a short period of time, unveils a surprising policy of industrial growth by encouraging pipelines, accessing resources of which Canada has an abundance, in order to enmesh and entrap China into a dependency upon very cheap, easy to acquire Canadian energy and minerals, which China desperately needs, in order to then be able to weaken the China-Russia alliance, because currently China is getting a lot of that from Russia, but they want to try to loosen that up. And so I think that Carney, I wouldn't be surprised if his job is to try to tell China, hey, look, it's a new Canada. We're both being victimized by the big baddie Americans. I feel you. We used to be bad, but now you can trust us. And look, we're building high-speed rail now. And so we should be friends now. And so I think he's trying to seduce the weaker-minded amongst the Chinese intelligentsia into accepting this new trick, which I think would be deadly for the Chinese if they fall for this, because then they could turn off the taps later on, which they want to, the oligarchy. So that's another scenario that I could very clearly see Carney gaming out, or being told to do as part of a higher game plan. Those are my concerns for the time being, at least.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on, you mentioned North American Union, and that is something that I wanted to touch on. So, like, North American Union, what is that like? Do you see Canada, the US, Mexico kind of becoming a union, or is it bigger than that? And who sort of presides over that. Let's put it that way, because I think that is what the two concerns that some people have anyway that I've heard is the whole idea that Canada becomes part of the North American Union. The other one is that we sort of align ourselves with the UK again, with the monarchy, and we sort of get absorbed into that, which, as we've discussed, I mean, we're kind of part of that anyway, right?
Yeah.
But educate me, help me on that,
Yeah, it's kind of both things. Both things can be true at the same time.
Hmm.
And if you think about like nested power structures, like shells within games within
Yeah.
games.
Yeah.
Definitely Carney's ambition to enmesh Canada ever more into the official, like we've always been there as far as being part of the British control system. Every lieutenant governor has to give royal assent,
Right,
as the official hand of the monarch to any law that is going to become law. It has to be given royal assent. If there's going to be a vote of no confidence, it has to be the governor general that gives royal assent to allow for the government to dissolve. And we've had examples of that where both opposition governments and minority governments have gone begging to the governor general of Canada to say, please, let us side with us, or side, like, why are you going to this unelected official who represents the legal hand of the crown? That happened in 2009. Most recently, but now Carney's invited the King Charles to come in and open up the Parliament with the crown speech, and people are like all freaking out, like, oh, it's so bad, and it is bad. But at the same time, it wouldn't be better if it was the Governor General who typically is the one to do that every session, because the Governor General is still the legal hand of the crown.
The same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a little bit more in your face now. They're rubbing it in more.
Yeah. So what do you think the optics of that are, right? Like, because I mean, I think a lot of people, wherever you fall on your belief system, I think a lot of people are like a little bit taken aback at the fact that he's coming over. Like what kind of message is that sending us by him being
they're
here?
normalizing it again, right? They're just trying to get us to. They're trying to normalize the reality that's been there the whole time, but now it's going to be a bit more visceral. We're going to have a much more hands-on crown authority, which has kind of come out of the closet a little bit more. It's been more underground. Now we're going to have an above ground thing that'll be a bit more in our face. So we have to get ready psychologically to experience a lot more of this sort of thing. Charles has made a point in what are called the spider memos, that were released some years back, that he's an activist king. He's put a lot of pressure during his time as prince on various parliamentarians to encourage environmental laws and things like that. And he's made a point that he's going to use things like the prerogative powers of the crown, of which there are many prerogative powers to declare war, to all sorts of things that the crown uniquely has and rarely has chosen to use up until now. But we're going to see, I think, a lot more of that, kind of like executive orders almost, but under the institution of a monarchy. And I think the other thing that I'm concerned about, I have hopes of patriots organized, but at the same time, here's all we're talking about all of like the points of concern to be aware of, and so I'm sharing all my fears.
Sure.
The other thing is, I think Trump is extremely psychologically weak on the issue of the monarchy. I think he thinks that it's different from the British deep state that has done him a lot of damage over the years. Like, Sir Richard Dearlove and Christopher Steele, they're all members of the they're all MI6 deep staters. But I think he makes the common error that many have made of differentiating the noble institution and grandeur of the crown as this noble thing of stability from this deep state, which in fact it's a direct emanation of the crown. So I think that's stupidity. That is stupidity. I really do think that. I could be wrong, but that's where I'm at right now. Prove me wrong. So I think he's charmed when he was offered by King Charles III the opportunity to become an associate member of the Commonwealth. And he said, that's a great idea. I love it. Many people who like Trump say he's just playing kayfabe. He's not being serious. I don't think so. But we'll see. But I think the danger here is that there is with the controlled, and the U.S., if there is no evidence. I like protective tariffs. I like them a lot. I'm not a fan of British free trade. That being said, there is a sloppy use of protective tariffs, which I see currently the current iteration of the the protective tariff system as highly sloppy, highly weaponized. It's not the type of protective tariffs that I recognize has been behind the better leaps into progress in American history, which was a wise use of protective. This is different. It's very mathematically driven. It's very much based upon threatening nations to cut off their relationships with China in order to avoid the protective tariffs. It's very much based on telling nations to transpose their indigenous manufacturing and expertise and technology to the United States, which will cripple and destroy those nations like Taiwan, or Taiwan is not a nation, but it will cripple those economies if they do it. Same thing for Vietnam or Indonesia. So this is messy. Real protective tariffs are supposed to enhance the well-being and productive power of your neighbor, not hurt others. It's not supposed to be. And so the only way for this to work and to avoid an economic calamity that's going to kill a lot of Americans is to first declare war on Wall Street. You got to do that in a way that involves reinvoking things like the Glass-Steagall Act that would break up the banks and let the bankers take their losses when the big bubble blows. We don't want the people to be destroyed by that oncoming bubble blowout. You want the private speculators to swallow that loss and go to jail, and you want the clean banks to be protected by the government. He's not doing that. He said it in one speech in 2016 and never said it again. And there's no evidence that Besant or any of these billionaires who represent a lot of those Wall Street interests have any interest in doing that at all. So without that, I could see the U.S. going into I don't know how long that will take before that tsunami hits, but it's going to be so bad that people will go crazy. And all of those scenarios that involve driving the U.S. into extremism on both sides, left and right extremism, that will involve accelerating what would be a civil war scenario for a period, would be much more conducive. And after that rendering of the U.S. into that mushy, broken basket case that would cause damage to everybody, then I could see also easily the reabsorption of the U.S. being given an ability to put food on their tables by simply being protected by the British Empire, which would possibly be less shaken up by this turmoil and be perceived to be the stable region of the world, Canada, that the U.S. would be absorbed into. And I think that it might look a lot like the type of control grid that would involve probably the control of Greenland, a lot of Central and Latin America, maybe going down to the Panama, which would create a region looking very similar to what, again, the Technocracy Inc. mandate had called for, maybe modeled on a more aggressive European Union dictatorship, which is what the North American Union was all about, with an Amaro, a digital Amaro of some sort that would be tied to our behavior and would then reward activity that would reduce our impact on nature and probably our lifespan too. So that's the sort of like dystopic scenario. Also, I would say one other thing, since I'm gaming this out with you, one other thing that I'm seeing as part of the, I'm sure this has been thought through, is President Harry and First Lady Meghan Markle. I could see that very clearly as part of the big punchline at the end of the day, since Meghan Markle, I mean, Harry's always been a bit of an embarrassment because it's kind of known amongst royal circles that Harry is the love child of Princess Diana and the polo player, the redheaded polo player. So it's kind of been a bit of an embarrassment. So they created, I think, a little novel piece of kabuki theater based on Markle being, partially black on some level, and creating like this scenario where they were so resentful and hurt by the racism of the Queen that they created a drama and gave up their privileges and claims to any title of heir of the British crown, and migrated to North America, where Meghan Markle's communications person, who's managing her sort of appearance and brand, is the same person who was employed by Hillary Clinton to do the same for Hillary. So I'm seeing that there's possibly a 15 to 20-year scenario, maybe longer, that would involve an older Markle-Harry combo, whether it's President Meghan Markle or President Harry being brought in, which would require a reset U.S. Constitution that would look nothing like the current Constitution to allow for a foreigner to be the president.
Wow. Yeah.
So that's another scenario I'm just throwing out there as something knowing how the oligarchy thinks and their sixth sense of humor. I could see that.
They get to be president of the outpost, right? So
Yeah.
yeah. Well, Matt, I know that you got to get going. I really appreciate your time, and wow, I learned a whole lot today. So thank you for filling me in, and you just filled in a lot of the blanks, right? So I kind of some of the stuff I knew a bit about, some of the stuff I didn't know about at all. So thank you so much for your time and also for your dedication to your work, because it's no easy feat these days. Like really getting into the weeds and going deep, So and I think it's what we need, because as we said at the beginning, so many people are just sort of skimming the surface and not really understanding a lot of the background, the context, the deeper origins. That's one of the things I've wanted to get into more on the show is how do we get here? How do we get here? Because people are just living in the moment going like, holy smokes, like here we are. And what the hell's going on? And when you actually understand some of the historical context, you can start to understand a bit more about how we actually got here, and that gives us a glimpse into where we're going as well. So
Absolutely.
yeah, thanks,
Dude,
thanks so much.
thank you. I appreciate that those words, and yeah, hopefully people. I mean, my sense is that if you understand something, you can't be afraid of it. If you truly understand it, if you don't do the heavy lifting to properly understand it, you might not be afraid of it for all the wrong reasons. There's some things that that we should be concerned about, and there's a reason there is such a thing as healthy fear, but you would see also the weak spots in the armor. And maybe the next time if we do a show again in the future, we could do something maybe a bit on the examples of where humanity was able to organize to prevent New World Order attempts from coming down on us. Because I think that people need some of those positive examples of history too, where humanity was much more competent and aware of the sophistication of evil than they are by and large today. So where did the empire lose in the game? So
there's so much distraction today. I mean, I think there's so much distraction with mindless stuff. I mean, whether it's just like watching cats on social media or watching movies or whatever it is, right? There's so many distractions. But I think also, and I would love to table a part 2, so I'm going to put that out there right now. But I also think that, especially people that are maybe in this space, we feel there's a growing sentiment that we are completely helpless. Like there's just nothing we can do. This is the end of the line. And certainly, the name of the podcast is Onward. And one of the things I'm trying to do is put forward-thinking solutions. And I think the solutions that we have to look at are very much outside the box. We're not voting our way out of this. I've discussed the judiciary captured, the political class captured. So, we can talk about that another time. But I think that, certainly thinking outside the box and being a bit more creative these days is definitely the direction we've got to go in. So, all right, cool. Thanks so much, Matt. I appreciate you. Appreciate your time. For those of you listening, watching, check the show notes. I'm going to dump a whole bunch of stuff in there, including where you can find Matt. If you're not following him on Substack, I'm going to throw the link in the first part of the additional resources, and definitely go and subscribe, follow his work. You're going to learn a whole ton if you just spend a bit of time on his page and dig into some of his stuff. So thanks so much for your time, Matt. All right, and thanks everyone for watching, for listening. Onwardpod.substack.com, and we'll catch up with you real soon.